Hello, Psychology 211. This is Beth Nicopoulos to talk a little bit about Chapter 14, Places and Spaces. This was, again, probably not the most interesting chapter to you, so I'm just going to review a couple of the take-home messages. Probably one of the biggest messages to think about is that throughout history, and for sure now, that the most desirable space is distributed unequally, meaning that those that can afford the most desirable space usually have those. And so research would show us that, class, race, and ethnicity are linked to the neighborhood that you live in. Usually you'll see people that are poor in less desirable neighborhoods, and that of course that crosses over class and race as well, and that you're also more likely to see them living in areas where they are exposed to hazardous waste. And throughout history that's been a real issue, mainly because in those wealthier neighborhoods, they're not as likely to try to get away with that disposal of such as that. One of the most important topics to kind of think about is something, and our book doesn't refer to it this way, but there's something called white flight. I'm sure you've heard it before. And really what that means is there was a time, and our book refers to the 1990s, in particular in 1997, Holmes said that in the mid to late 90s, whites tended to sort of flee out of town to the suburbs, to the country, and they left those sort of ethnically and culturally rich center cities and fled out to the suburbs, to sort of the wealthier neighborhoods. I would argue that happened a long time ago. And if you'll look at this week's readings, what you'll discover is that there are those that say that trend is reversing, that it's now kind of cool to live, let's say, in downtown Dallas, that there's a lot more prime real estate. But as more people think it's good to live there, they also sometimes bring higher prices, so that might drive folks that can't afford the neighborhood out in the reverse direction. One of the other things they talk about is what they call the income gap. And if you'll look on this week's tab also, there is a state-by-state breakdown of the income gap. And what you'll see is they take the very top salary or income, and they look at the very bottom, and then there's a percentage calculated based on that. And you'll see that it's listed in order of income gap. And it's pretty impressive when you look at the numbers or the disparity between the two. It might be kind of interesting to also look in the United States, because there are those that say that that gap is continuing to widen, that the middle class, if you will, is starting to shrink. Our book also talks about some of the things that might have led to the sort of the shift in where people are living. So after World War II, we were very much, as you remember from last week, an industrial mechanized society where a lot of people worked in factories and could have a good job even without so much of an education. And now, as we've changed to a more computerized society, those industries are now somewhat disappearing, and so people don't necessarily have to live in that core or right around the areas where that industry used to be. So, technology has made it so that you can live almost anywhere and work almost anywhere if you're able to work online. So it's given people more options in terms of places to live. They also talk a little bit about the differences, regional differences amongst states and areas. I think we've talked a lot about this probably earlier in the class as well. So we know that there are differences between different states in speech, the way they sound, religion, politics, race, and even ethnicity as well. They make sort of a statement which I think is quite true, and that is the American South is mostly Protestant, and you maybe don't see quite so many varying religions, and it's also very conservative politically as well. They call that the Bible Belt. It's sort of questionable whether in Texas we're part of that. I would say we're part of the Bible Belt, but most people would not consider Texas the Deep South. And if you've ever traveled to Alabama in particular, Mississippi, then once you do that, then you realize what the difference is. And then they talk about sort of the polar opposite when you go to the East Coast. Boston, New York are more Catholic and Jewish, so they tend to be a little bit more liberal. So also pay attention this week to the concept of urbanization. And so that's sort of that transformation of sort of a rural area into one that's more of a city or more of a town, if you will. And if you look at what's happened in particular in Dallas, you know, it used to be just Dallas as a core, and then there were far out suburbs, Richardson and Plano. Now, Richardson and Plano aren't that far out anymore, and people go further and further out to find affordable places to live, which is part of what drives that urbanization as well. And then they also talk about something that's very much happened in Dallas and some of our neighboring larger cities, and that's gentrification. So that's, you know, taking old, rundown, abandoned, low-value properties in areas and making them more valuable, revitalizing homes and businesses. And you'll see they're trying to do that along the Trinity River in Dallas. Some of the Oak Lawn neighborhoods have become, you know, more popular for, you know, younger people to revitalize those homes. And so you see a little bit of a shift that's not just demographic based. So as you answer the question this week, yes, the answer to the question is Homes 1997. So make sure you pay attention to that as you answer. And then I also ask you to share your experience where you grew up and how that's impacted you in terms of your idea of diversity. I've heard from a lot of you that you came from maybe smaller towns, and so it was sort of a culture shock coming to a university that's larger. So until next time, I guess that's chapter 15. Thank you, Psychology 211.